It started with a single garden gnome. I noticed it one Tuesday morning while watering my prized rose bushes. The little ceramic fellow with his pointed red hat was sitting smugly on what I knew to be my side of the property line, right next to the surveyor's stake that had been there since I bought my house 3 years ago. Karen Pemberton, our H.O.A. president and next-door neighbor, was outside pretending to check her mailbox, but obviously watching my reaction. She had that particular smile she wore whenever she thought she was being clever. The woman had turned micromanagement into an art form since taking over the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association 2 years ago. Every week brought a new nitpicky rule or complaint about someone's mailbox height or the wrong shade of beige on a front door. I'll give her credit though. She's consistent in her commitment to making everyone else's life difficult. I walked over to the gnome and examined the area. Sure enough, it was a good 6 inches onto my property. The property line ran in a perfectly straight line from the street to our back fences, marked by those small metal stakes the surveyor had placed. Karen's gnome was definitely trespassing. "Morning, Karen," I called out cheerfully. "I think your garden decoration wandered over to visit my roses." She strutted over in her oversized sun hat and rhinestone-studded gardening gloves, the kind that had never seen actual dirt. "Oh, that little thing? I'm pretty sure that's right on the line. Maybe even on my side." I pointed to the surveyor's stake barely 3 feet away. "The property line is clearly marked. Your gnome is on my property." Karen squinted at the stake like she was seeing it for the first time, though she'd lived here for 8 years. "Those old stakes aren't necessarily accurate. Property lines shift over time. I think I'll keep Norbert right where he is. He looks happy there." Norbert. She had named the gnome. "Karen, I'd appreciate if you'd move your decoration back to your own property. It's nothing personal, just a matter of respecting boundaries." Her smile grew wider and more condescending. "As H.O.A. president, I think I have a pretty good understanding of property matters. Norbert stays." She turned on her heel and marched back to her house, leaving me standing there with a ceramic intruder in my garden. The next morning brought reinforcements. Norbert had been joined by a decorative mushroom and a small wind chime that tinkled annoyingly every time a breeze stirred. All 3 items were clearly on my side of the line. I knocked on Karen's door, armed with my property survey documents. She answered wearing a fuzzy pink bathrobe and curlers in her hair, looking like she'd been expecting me. "Karen, we need to resolve this property line issue. I have the official survey here showing exactly where our boundaries are." She barely glanced at the paperwork. "Surveys can be wrong. I've been living here much longer than you, sweetie. I think I know where my property ends." She emphasized the word sweetie, like it was an insult. "The survey was done by a licensed professional. These stakes are legally recognized markers." "Well, maybe you should have your property resurveyed if you're so concerned. Until then, my decorations are staying put." She started to close the door, then paused. "Oh, and speaking of H.O.A. matters, I noticed your rose bushes are growing a bit high. The covenant states that landscaping cannot obstruct sight lines. You might want to trim those back." My roses were nowhere near tall enough to obstruct anything, but I could see where this was headed. By the end of the week, Karen had established what could only be described as a decorative beachhead on my property. Garden gnomes, fake mushrooms, a small bird bath, and a collection of gaudy wind chimes had claimed roughly a 4-foot strip of my front lawn. She'd even run a small decorative border of white rocks along what she apparently considered to be the real property line. When I approached her about it, she had an H.O.A. violation notice ready for me. "Your roses are now officially too tall," she announced triumphantly. "And I noticed some weeds in your back flower bed. The covenant requires all homeowners to maintain pristine landscaping." The weeds were 3 dandelions that had sprouted after Tuesday's rain. I decided to try the reasonable approach one more time. I hired a second surveyor to confirm the property boundaries, thinking that maybe fresh documentation would resolve the dispute. The new survey confirmed exactly what the first one had shown. The property line ran straight and true, and Karen's decorative invasion was entirely on my land. Armed with 2 professional surveys, I requested a formal H.O.A. board meeting to address the property encroachment. Karen, as president, was required to schedule it within 30 days. She scheduled it for 8 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, and held it in her living room. The only other board members present were her friend Dolores from 3 houses down, and her next-door neighbor on the other side, Bill, who always agreed with whatever Karen said because she'd threatened to cite him for his unauthorized garden shed. The chair recognizes the complaint regarding alleged property line disputes, Karen announced formally, sitting behind her dining room table like a judge. She was wearing a business suit for the occasion, complete with a name tag that said President Karen Pemberton. I presented both surveys, complete with photographs showing the surveyor stakes and measurements. I'd even created a simple diagram, showing exactly where each of Karen's decorations sat in relation to the legal property boundary. Karen barely looked at the evidence. The board finds that property boundaries in established neighborhoods can be subject to interpretation. Without concrete barriers like fences, residents often rely on practical use patterns to determine reasonable boundaries. Motion to dismiss the complaint. I second the motion, said Dolores immediately. All in favor? Karen asked. 3 hands went up. Motion carries. Complaint dismissed. This meeting is adjourned. The entire proceedings had taken less than 10 minutes. I stood there holding my surveys and photographs, realizing I was dealing with someone who had no intention of playing by reasonable rules. Karen's smile was practically glowing. Better luck next time, sweetie. Oh, and you still need to trim those roses. I'll be conducting another inspection this weekend. That evening, I sat in my home office looking over my property documents and researching my options. As a retired corporate attorney with 30 years of experience in real estate law, I knew I had several paths forward. I could file a formal complaint with the county, hire a lawyer to send threatening letters, or even pursue a civil lawsuit for property encroachment. But Karen had made this personal. She wasn't just stealing my land. She was using her position as H.O.A. president to harass me with frivolous violations while simultaneously thumbing her nose at clearly established legal boundaries. This called for a more creative solution. I spent the next few days doing research. Willowbrook Estates had been built in 1985 on land that was previously a small family farm. The H.O.A. had been established with the original development, and like many suburban associations, it had broad powers over property use within the community. Karen wielded these powers like a petty dictator, but she'd forgotten something important about power. It works both ways. The breakthrough came when I was reviewing the original H.O.A. covenants and the county property records. Our neighborhood had been carved out of a larger parcel, but the developers had been clever about maximizing the number of lots they could create. They'd used every available inch of space, which meant the H.O.A. common areas were minimal. In fact, according to the original plat map, there were only 3 small common areas in the entire development. A tiny pocket park at the main entrance, a small retention pond near the back of the neighborhood, and one other interesting piece of property. A strip of land exactly 20 feet wide running along the back edge of Karen's property. I pulled up the detailed property records and cross-referenced them with the H.O.A. documentation. Sure enough, that 20-foot strip was designated as H.O.A. common area, intended for utilities and drainage. Karen's back fence, her prized vegetable garden, her storage shed, and her elaborate back patio were all built on H.O.A. common property that she'd been treating as her own for years. Even better, I discovered that Karen had recently applied for a county permit to install a hot tub on that exact strip of common land. The irony was so perfect I almost laughed out loud. As an H.O.A. member in good standing, I had every right to petition the board for exclusive use of common areas, provided I followed the proper procedures, and the use didn't conflict with the area's designated purpose. The 20-foot strip behind Karen's house was designated for utilities and drainage, but there was nothing in the covenants that prevented recreational use as long as it didn't interfere with those primary functions. I spent the weekend crafting my petition. As a former attorney, I made sure every single word was legally precise and completely compliant with both the H.O.A. covenants and county regulations. I requested exclusive use rights to the 20-foot common area strip for the purpose of installing a recreational vehicle storage and maintenance facility. Monday morning, I submitted my petition to the H.O.A. board, with copies sent via certified mail to ensure proper documentation. According to the covenants, the board had to respond within 45 days. While I waited, Karen escalated her property line war. She installed a decorative fence that curved about 3 feet onto my property, claiming it followed the natural boundary between our lots. She planted a row of marigolds that stretched from her front walkway across my lawn to within a few feet of my front door. She even had the audacity to put up a small sign reading, "Pemberton's Peaceful Garden," right in the middle of my property. Each encroachment came with a new H.O.A. violation for me. My mailbox was suddenly not regulation black, despite being the exact same mailbox I'd had for 3 years. My driveway had excessive oil staining from a tiny spot where I'd changed my car's oil 2 years ago. My house numbers were faded and non-compliant, even though they were clearly visible and identical to every other house on the street. "You seem to be having trouble following community standards," Karen mentioned during one of her property inspections. "Maybe suburban living isn't for you. I know several people who might be interested in buying your house if you decide to relocate." I just smiled and continued watering my roses. The 44th day after submitting my petition, Karen called an emergency H.O.A. board meeting. This time she held it in the evening at the community center, and she'd managed to gather a few more board members for the occasion. She clearly thought having a larger audience would help her case. "We're here to address a frivolous petition from one of our residents," she announced to the 7 people in attendance. "The petitioner is requesting exclusive use of common area for some sort of storage facility, which is obviously inappropriate for our upscale community." I stood up with my folder of documents. "Madam President, I believe you're required to read the full petition before discussion begins." Karen's face tightened, but she couldn't refuse without violating her own meeting procedures. She read my petition aloud, her voice getting more strained with each carefully worded paragraph. When she finished, the room was quiet. "This is clearly a spite petition," she declared. "The board should reject it immediately." "Actually," I said, standing up again, "I'd like to present some additional documentation to support my petition." I walked to the front of the room and began laying out enlarged copies of the original neighborhood plat map, the H.O.A. covenant documents, and the county property records. With a laser pointer I'd brought for the occasion, I carefully showed how the 20-foot strip was clearly designated as common area, how it had never been legally transferred to any individual property owner, and how my proposed use was entirely consistent with the covenants. Then I pulled out the photographs. "These pictures show the current unauthorized use of H.O.A. common property," I announced, clicking through images of Karen's back fence, her vegetable garden, her storage shed, her patio, and her pending hot tub installation. According to county records, the property owner has been treating common area as private property for approximately 6 years without board approval. Karen had gone very pale. "Those improvements were made in good faith. Everyone knows that's part of my backyard." "Unfortunately, good faith doesn't change legal property boundaries," I replied, "as the board is well aware from recent discussions regarding property line disputes." I could see the exact moment when Karen realized what was happening, but she was trapped by her own procedures and her own arguments. She'd spent weeks telling me that property boundaries were legally established and couldn't be changed by assumption or long-term use. She'd dismissed my surveys and refused to acknowledge my property rights. Now she was facing the same legal standards she'd used to dismiss my complaints. The board had no choice but to approve my petition. Karen's own precedent made it impossible for them to deny a properly submitted request backed by clear documentation and legal property records. 3 weeks later, the county approved my permits for the recreational vehicle storage and maintenance facility. I'd been very specific in my applications. The facility would include covered storage for multiple recreational vehicles, a maintenance area with appropriate drainage and utility access, security lighting, and a perimeter fence for safety and security purposes. Karen tried everything she could think of to stop the project. She filed complaints with the county claiming the facility would violate setback requirements, but my surveyor had been very careful to ensure everything was properly positioned within the common area boundaries. She claimed it would create noise and traffic issues, but recreational vehicle maintenance was specifically listed as an allowable use in the county zoning regulations. She even tried to argue that the H.O.A. board hadn't had proper authority to grant the exclusive use rights, But her own attorney informed her that the board had followed correct procedures, and the approval was legally binding. The construction crew arrived on a Monday morning. By Wednesday, they'd removed Karen's back fence. By Friday, her vegetable garden was gone. The following Monday, they demolished her storage shed and jackhammered up her patio. The hot tub that had been delivered the week before was hauled away by the manufacturer when they discovered it couldn't be legally installed on the property. Karen stood in her backyard watching the work, her face cycling through disbelief, rage, and growing panic as she realized the full scope of what was happening. The facility itself was a masterpiece of petty perfection. I'd hired the most expensive recreational vehicle storage company in the state to design a facility that was both completely functional and utterly overwhelming for a suburban backyard. The covered storage building was 30 feet wide and 60 feet long, painted in regulation H.O.A. beige, but impossible to ignore. The maintenance area included hydraulic lifts, air compressors, and industrial lighting that automatically activated at dusk. The security fence was 8 feet tall with decorative iron spikes along the top, completely blocking Karen's view of the woods she'd enjoyed for 8 years. But the real genius was in the details I'd insisted on. The facility's driveway connected directly to the street, but the most convenient route required crossing the corner of Karen's front lawn, right through the area where she'd been placing her garden decorations. The county had granted an easement for access, which meant Karen couldn't block the route with gnomes, mushrooms, or decorative fences. The security lighting was motion-activated and extremely bright, designed to illuminate the entire facility whenever anyone approached. Since the lights faced Karen's house, her bedroom window was directly in their path. The maintenance activities were restricted to daytime hours per the county permit, but recreational vehicle owners tend to be early risers who like to prepare for weekend trips at dawn on Saturdays. Karen tried one last desperate gambit. She showed up at my front door on a Saturday morning, her hair disheveled and dark circles under her eyes from the security lights that had been triggering every time a cat walked through the area. "We need to work something out," she said, her voice barely controlled. "This has gone too far. I'll move my decorations back to my property. I'll stop the H.O.A. violations. We can call it even." I looked past her to where 3 RV owners were preparing their vehicles for a weekend camping trip, their generators humming as they checked their electrical systems. The facility was already proving popular with neighborhood residents who'd never had anywhere to store their recreational vehicles before. "I'm sorry, Karen, but property boundaries are legally established," I replied, using her exact words from our first dispute. "They can't be changed by assumption or good faith agreements." Her face went through several interesting color changes as the full implications hit her. The facility lease was for 15 years with automatic renewal options. The easement across her front lawn was permanent. The security lighting and maintenance activities were all properly permitted and completely legal. And because she'd dismissed my surveys and refused to acknowledge clear property boundaries, she'd established the legal precedent that property rights couldn't be negotiated away through friendly agreements. She'd weaponized the system against me over a 6-inch garden gnome encroachment. Now she was facing the same system scaled up to industrial proportions, and she finally understood that I hadn't just outmaneuvered her. I'd used her own rules to create a permanently devastating countermove that would make her life miserable for the next decade and a half. Karen stood there in my doorway, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly as she processed the full scope of what I'd accomplished, her face a perfect picture of someone realizing they'd been completely and utterly outplayed.